Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from Jenny02. I'm talking about the debut album from Skinny Puppy, Bites. Alright, Skinny Puppy. This Canadian band is often marked as one of the most influential names in industrial music and EBM. Two genres that tend to be a bit of a blind spot in my electronic music knowledge. Originally the duo of Kevin Ogilvy, aka Nivek Ogre, and Kevin Crompton, aka Kevin Key, Kevin starting with a C and with the E capitalized. And at the time this album came out, back in 1985, also featuring this guy called Wilhelm Schroeder, better known as Bill Lieb, who would go on to form his own industrial outfit, Frontline Assembly, which I actually have covered before, though he only appears on 2 tracks here, and left the band shortly after this project was released. I've gotten lots of requests to at least look into this band for years now. I know one commenter in particular has made his status as a Skinny Puppy fan quite clear to me several times and recommended this album in particular as something I'd like, although that's not the same person who actually paid for this request. The person who paid for this video gave me the option to either cover this album, their later album from 1990, Too Dark Park, or Massive Attack's Protection, and while the latter is probably my favorite Massive Attack album, and it'd be nice to have a video explaining my somewhat complicated thoughts on that band, I decided to err on the side of educating myself on something I hadn't previously heard before, and Too Dark Park didn't sound like it'd be my thing as much from the bits I briefly previewed through. A lot more abrasive, noisy, metal-tinged than this, which sounded a lot more electronic and in the vein of fellow industrial pioneers Cabaret Voltaire, which I've obviously been a fan of for much longer. At this point in time, Cabaret Voltaire in particular were already in their middle period, helping form the new wave synth-pop styles of the time, albeit with more their own experimental edge, and Skinny Puppy were very much following suit. But this thing doesn't entirely sit in the Cab's shadow. The grooves have more body to them, the lead vocals are obviously a lot more intense and guttural, much like Bill Lieb's, and including plenty of disparate horror movie samples, helping lay down the formulas that you still see out of this genre to this day. Honestly though, if not for the vocals, Bites would actually be a pretty agreeable listen. Instrumentally, it's a fairly prototypical but serviceable collection of 80s synth-pop beats, not far away from the material you'd find on Depeche Mode albums from around the same time. I can see why this is often marked as a fairly easy entry point for those not already into industrial music to be able to get into it. And the vocals would bother me a lot more if I hadn't already marathoned the entire Frontline Assembly catalog years ago and already knew what to expect as far as vocals in this genre go. I mean, sure, Nivek Ogre constantly either sounds like one of the Daleks from Doctor Who or like he's on the verge of throwing up. But these really aren't even among the most off-putting performances I've ever heard in this vein. His presence does not bother me. Now, Skinny Puppy would go on to deliver significantly more abrasive mixes in the following years, the kind of which would even become inspiration for bands like Nine Inch Nails. But this mix of fairly accessible 80s instrumentals with growling vocals is where it all started for them. Now, this album has lots of different versions out there, but the one I listen to and the most widely available version is a 1993 CD reissue, which has 17 tracks and runs on for 73 minutes total, both including all the tracks from its original 1985 vinyl version, all the tracks exclusives to other versions on other formats and in other countries, and even a few previously unreleased cuts from the same era. Supposedly this thing is meant to be split up into 2 halves called Attack and Decay, though the 2 halves really aren't that distinguishable from each other. You'd think this would add up to a grueling or overstuffed listen, like a deluxe edition of an album or something, but it really isn't that bad. While there's not an absolute ton of variety, there's just enough for this thing to not feel boring or samey. More intense banger-type tracks like Assimilate, Deadlines, or The Choke can get balanced out with more experimental cuts, like the looped vocal samples of Church, the skittery, almost proto-IDM instrumental Tomorrow, the sparse and plinky, clattering excursions of Dead Doll, the almost Tangerine Dream-esque interlude Film featuring lots of really cool cascades of synth melodies and slap bass. Would have made for a particularly solid closer on the original version. Though this particular edition's ending is pretty solid too, with two much more ambient-centric cuts. There's a 9-minute kind of more down-tempo cut in The Center Bullet that's pretty epic, and then a hidden track called One Day, which is even more low-key than anything else here. I also have to give a shout out to the track Basement, which particularly stood out to me since I recognized the samples from The Legend of Hell House they utilize here as being the same ones Orbital would go on to use on their track I Don't Know You People. I mean, it may not surprise you to hear that I much prefer the way Orbital utilized those samples. I mean, an interlude on an album I've just heard for the first time a few days ago is not gonna beat a fully fleshed out cut from my favorite band of all time that I've loved for over a decade. But I bet you this cut probably inspired Orbital to use the same idea. I already know those guys liked industrial music from their giving shouts to Cabaret Voltaire all the time, and I would not be surprised if this album was already a favorite of theirs and they wanted to, you know, sort of homage them or something like that when they made I Don't Know You People. So that's cool. Now, not every track on Bites really stands out, and some of them can blend into the mix of all the Kraftwerky instrumentals with growling vocals. Especially as we start moving into the second half of the project, I start having less stuff to say about cuts like Last Call or Falling or any of those, as they start to feel more like filler and rehashing other ideas elsewhere on the album. They're still able to pace it in such a way that you don't feel like the tracks are blending into an incoherent mush. They keep like changing up the tempo, so for every cut with a slightly faster pulse, like Deadlines and The Choke, you get one with like a much slower and stomping groove like Icebreaker and Social Deception. The latter cut was not one of my favorites. The vocals on that one did get to be a bit much, but whatever. That one's still alright. Another weird thing about this album is that even though all these cuts vary quite heavily in terms of their length, anywhere from under 2 minutes to almost 7 minutes, and the one 9-minute cut as well, for whatever reason, all these cuts feel around the same length. They don't feel equal in importance, but the shorter cuts feel longer than they really are, and the longer cuts all feel shorter than they really are. I'm not really sure why. It's not like there's a ton of progression within these cuts regardless of length, but that's what happened. I don't think I can really complain about that. But that's about all I got in terms of like individual tracks and how the album itself plays out. On a personal level, I'm not sure if this is going to be the kind of thing I end up hanging on to long term. While I can definitely respect this project for its place in history and how it helped set the groundwork for this particular genre, and how well it still holds up to this day, this still isn't really my favorite genre. And I don't just mean I'm not typically like an industrial EBM kind of guy. I'm just not much of an 80s guy in general. This kind of 80s production just doesn't often excite me. There may be occasional exceptions like Depeche Mode's Music for the Masses, Cabaret Voltaire's The Crackdown, and Kraftwerk's Electric Cafe, where both the tunes and the weirder textures and sonic variety are engaging enough where I don't care how 80s it sounds, and keep me wanting to come back anyway. But it's rare for me to outright love super 80s sounding material like this. And I'm not really sure why that's always been the case. I'm obviously not like that for super 90s sounding material. It's just a personal taste thing. This album's weird enough to generally pull me in, and the way it kept me invested for well over an hour without me getting bored certainly brings it close to great territory for me, but there is still a part of me who wishes its weirder moments got even weirder than they did. The more straightforward cuts and the more abstract cuts sounding pretty similar to each other led me not quite loving any of it, despite at least liking all of it. I suspect this is going to get similar treatment from me as Frontline Assembly's Tactical Neural Implant, the kind of project I can randomly recommend to anyone interested to get into this genre, but I don't personally put on very often. And honestly, I think I'm more likely to return to that one. While the production on this album is significantly better than TNI, the pacing and variety is also better and is just an all-around more easily accessible listen, TNI is also a much tighter listen, and it stands out a lot more from the kind of material I usually listen to. Bites is a lot closer to being in my element, but that means there's less novelty to me putting it on. I probably enjoy both of those projects about equally, by the way. But yeah, take that all as you will. Whether I like it or not, this album is still a classic, pretty ahead of its time even for 1985, and still holds up to this day as being pretty solid all around. I may only really like this thing and not love it, but I definitely understood its importance right away, and despite the length, I didn't feel like this thing especially dragged. It's still not the kind of thing I personally tend to go out of my way to seek out, but it is still a lot more easily approachable than it might look, and I can co-sign this and recommend giving it a shot, even to those not already a fan of industrial music. So yeah, this gets a very strong 7.7 out of 10 from me. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.